we take our national defense as seriously as steel. We respect free trade, but only with reliable partners. Hello, the EU has finally cut ties to the defense economy. The decision to impose a 50% tariff on steel imported from outside the EU is not just a trade measure, but a strong signal to protect industrial security. South Korea is particularly vulnerable. The iron ore industry, which has been deeply dependent on iron ore, is facing a carbon tax and dual taxation. Meanwhile, Japan, led by Japan, is quietly and steadily improving its position. We will take a closer look at the structural contradictions and collapse of trust that South Korea is currently facing from various perspectives. Please watch until the end. The Commission has officially announced that it will impose an additional 50% tariff on steel mesh imports from October 2025. The aim is simple. Is to restrict low-priced steel from Asian countries such as China and South Korea, and to protect the Japanese sex industry. South Korea has already advocated strategic independence with products such as EVs and solar panels, and the iron ore industry is following in the same vein. This move is part of the economic defense that accelerated in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, and can be said to be a practical version of the EU's overtime testing policy. However, the country that has been most shocked by this decision is South Korea. Approximately 17% of South Korea's iron exports go to the EU. In particular, iron for construction materials and automobiles has been highly valued in the German and French markets. However, with this tax hike, South Korean iron ore will suddenly lose its price competitiveness. For example, if a 50% tax hike is imposed on iron ore that South Korean POSCO has been shipping at a profit for $1,200 per ton, the price will jump to nearly $1,800. From the perspective of EU companies, there is no reason to go out of your way to choose expensive South Korean iron ore. EU companies such as ArcelorMittal are regaining their price stability, and it is certain that South Korean companies will lose a significant amount of market share. Furthermore, environmental costs are a serious concern for South Korea. Under the CBAM introduced by the EU, South Korean companies will have to pay a carbon tax based on the amount of carbon dioxide added to iron that is eliminated when producing iron. Under EU standards, South Korean iron ore with high emissions will have to bear an additional carbon tax of up to €80 per unit. As a result, EU export profits have almost disappeared. Some in South Korea are even saying that the situation is more serious than the second round of exports. The EU's move is not just a tax cut, but part of its security policy. Since the war in Ukraine, the EU has learned the lesson of its energy dependence. It is moving to reduce external dependence in all industries, including steel, energy, food, and metals. In this context, exporting countries like South Korea have been completely disadvantaged. South Korean media criticized the EU for being unfair and for protectionism. However, the EU later responded, saying, "We value national defense as much as steel. We respect free trade, but we need a reliable partner." Quote. In fact, this word, trust, is the element that South Korea lacks the most. The South Korean steel industry once rivaled Japan in technology, but in recent years, a series of scandals, including reports of quality fraud and falsification, have caused it to lose international credibility. An EU official spoke on condition of anonymity. South Korean companies have prioritized cost reduction over technology, and the reliability of their security is too low. This collapse of trust was the biggest reason why the EU excluded Koreans. Quote. Going forward, the Korean steel industry, having lost the EU, will likely lose its market and export excess production to China and Southeast Asia. As a result, scientific competition will intensify, and Korean companies will find themselves in a bind. For the Korean economy, this oil tariff is not just a trade barrier, but a test that forces structural change. The old export-oriented economic model has reached its limits. Korea now has no choice but to strengthen its domestic market. However, the reality of low consumption, unemployment among the younger generation, and a mountain of household debt prevents this reform. What awaits us in the future may be the collapse of an industrial structure that is outdated. Japan stands to benefit the most from the EU's decision to impose a steel tariff. Japan in particular is attracting attention. For many years, Japan has built up trust in the world arena by focusing on quality and a cash-for-sales strategy. The EU's defensive policy is creating an environment that favors Japanese-style management. Japan has been quietly sorting out its relationship with Korean companies for the past few years. In the past, there was technical cooperation and cooperation between Korea and Japan, but a series of intellectual property infringements and lawsuits led Japan to eventually sell off most of its Korean shares. It is not just an investment decision, but also a national decision to protect technology. Costco criticized this as a betrayal of Japan, but in reality it was due to South Korea's disregard for Japanese technology. Japan's steel control systems and ultra-high-speed travel technology are so precise and have extremely high-quality stability that only a limited number of companies in the world can handle them. South Korean companies tried to catch up in this field, but in the end they were unable to keep up with the technology and fell behind in quality, safety and environmental standards. As of 2025, Japan is accelerating its global expansion, winning large-scale projects in the US, India and other countries. In particular, Japanese companies are being re-evaluated as a reliable partner to supply iron against the backdrop of the EU's strengthened defense policy. A British economist reported as follows: "Japaneseness is the silent champion, creating markets with integrity, not sloppiness." On the other hand, South Korea's iron industry is in a very advanced situation. Relying too much on price competition, R&D investment has been postponed, and South Korea is lagging behind in technologies such as deoxidization and AI control. Since the entire global economy is structured in a way that relies on exports and specific markets, if import restrictions are tightened as in the EU, the entire industry will be shaken. Experts call this a structural disease. Profit margins for South Korean steel companies have declined over the past decade. In addition to weak domestic demand, key industries such as construction, automobiles, and railway expansion are also in a slump, making it difficult to maintain sales prices. Furthermore, the weak yen and the narrowness of the yen's exchange rate have increased current import costs. While Japan has a solid domestic supply base and technological capabilities, South Korea is heavily dependent on external sources, putting it in a vulnerable position. Japanese companies also responded early to the EU's carbon regulations. They are conducting demonstration experiments on deoxidization technologies such as hydrogen reduction and carbon recycling, and are establishing a sustainable steel industry with state subsidies. In contrast, South Korean companies have made formal green declarations, but their actual capital investment and deployment records are poor, and they cannot avoid being at a disadvantage under the EU's CBM system. A Japanese industry insider says, "A serious gap has emerged in both technology and the environment. The EU regulations are actually an opportunity for Japan." What is interesting is that the Japanese government has not completely withdrawn from the South Korean market, but is observing it from a distance. The Japanese fully understand that the South Korean government is in need of Japanese iron technology while stating that it is a half-Japanese policy. However, given the past history of technology leaks and contract breaches, the reality is that the possibility of this happening is extremely low. Japan has not forgotten its lessons. It is reflecting on the fact that it extended too much support to South Korean companies from the 1990s to the 2000s, which led to the development of the self-proclaimed rivals that we have today. The current South Korean industry seems to be clinging to past successes. The era known as the "Miracle of Korea" was realized with the support of Japanese funds and technical know-how. However, South Korea does not have the ability to repeat that. Rising domestic labor costs, lagging environmental standards, and above all, a lack of trust are keeping international partners away. The Korea Economic Daily's theory is that we need to be replaced. We have lost our pride, not our technology. We are being appointed based on criticism of other countries, not our own efforts. There is an increasing number of young South Koreans on social media who want to work in Japan. Japan is stable. There are many comments stating that South Korea is always unstable. The attractiveness of domestic employment is rapidly declining. This is not just a gap between companies, but also a symbol of the gap in national trust. The South Korean government has set out the Iron Light Future Vision 2030 as a countermeasure, but its contents are not very feasible and its budgetary backing is unclear. On the other hand, Japan is steadily achieving results through private sector leadership. The awareness of protecting industry for the sake of the nation is shared by both policy and companies, and as a result, it is solidifying its position as a trusted supplier overseas. If South Korea aims to make a comeback in line with Japan, it must first start from the highest level of trust. This also means emulating the honest attitude of the Japanese character. However, in reality, economic rationality is being put on the back burner as political half-hearted attitudes are gaining popularity domestically. Ironically, this contradiction is the biggest obstacle or hindrance to South Korean industry. The EU's totalistic policies are not merely iron-fisted controls, but have shifted the dividing line between a trust-based economy and a self-destructive one. While Japanese character is quietly gaining recognition, South Korea is becoming increasingly isolated as it raises its voice. As the EU's totalitarianism spread, South Korea was desperate to calm the chaos in its domestic economy. Amidst this chain of crises, including capital outflows, falling stock prices, and a decline in international credibility, the South Korean government suddenly put forward its trump card: a demand for an unlimited currency swap with the United States. Unlimited swap. Just hearing the name alone makes it sound like an economic alliance with the United States. However, in reality, it was an extremely unrealistic demand. A swap is an agreement between two countries to exchange one country's currency with the other's currency in advance. It is a system that allows the other country's currency to be used for financial purposes and prevents short-term dollar shortages, but if it were unlimited, the story would be different. The scale would be equivalent to 84% of South Korea's total financial reserves, and would be more than 4 times its liquid assets, a scale that would not be feasible at the national level. The U.S. Federal Reserve Board currently limits the countries with which it has concluded unlimited swap lines. The countries in question are Canada, the United Kingdom, the EU, Japan, and Switzerland. All of these are countries with which there is an extremely high level of political and economic trust. In other words, it is almost impossible for a country like South Korea, which has an unstable economic foundation and political risks, to be lumped together. Nevertheless, the background to South Korea's repeated demands is the serious dollar shortage. The dollar depreciation continues and foreign currencies are rapidly withdrawing from the South Korean market, while foreign reserves appear to be holding steady at around $350 billion for the time being. Much of this is in the form of bonds and assets based on appraised value, and usable dollar assets account for only about a quarter of that. In other words, it is only an appearance of security. South Korean media reported as if the SLAPP request was on the verge of success. However, financial authorities in Washington remain calm. Unlimited SLAPP is a symbol of trust, not something that can be given to a country asking for help. This one sentence says it all. Economists and investors pointed out 3 serious contradictions in South Korea's request. The first contradiction is the unrealistic scale. Unlimited SLAPP is only available to countries with the same level of credit as the US and the Fed. For the US, the South Korean economy does not have enough strategic value to prevent financial manipulation in other countries. South Korea's GDP is about a quarter of Japan's, and its trade with the US is limited, meaning that there is no opportunity for the US to supply unlimited amounts of dollars. Furthermore, in order to utilize the US Fed swap arc, the central bank of the other country must have an extremely transparent accounting system and an international platform. The IMF has pointed out that the accounting system of the Bank of Korea is insufficient in its risk reporting, and it is technically almost impossible. The second is a flaw in the negotiation structure. The South Korean government argued that concluding a swap would restore market confidence, but the negotiation method itself was the opposite. The more it repeatedly demands support in diplomatic settings, the more it gives the world the impression that the South Korean economy is in danger. Originally, a swap is a preparatory contract between trusted countries, and is not something that is rushed into after a crisis has occurred. Please do that. The moment it officially stated that there would be no limit, South Korea's currency policy had a major negative impact on market sentiment. Rumors spread in the market that South Korea had reached its limit. Dealing funds began selling en masse, and as a result, the warm exchange rate fell to the 165 per dollar range. In other words, it ended up devaluing its own currency by asking for help. The final contradiction is the counterproductive effect on market sentiment. The swap negotiations should be reassuring. However, in the case of South Korea, the government leaked the content of the negotiations to the media and reported that the United States was positive, simultaneously creating unfounded expectations and anxiety on the ground. A few days later, trust completely collapsed when U.S. government officials denied that such an issue existed. The Wall Street Journal argued that South Korea had advertised to the world that it was seeking help. Alone is a sign of trust, and the more desperate a country seeks it, the further it retreats. In other words, what South Korea should have done was build trust, not negotiate. But time was already running out. The issue of unlimited swaps is not just a financial issue. It is also a symbol of trust diplomacy. Japan, Switzerland, and the UK can maintain unlimited swaps not simply because they have strong economies, but because they are based on a foundation of international rules, autonomy, and transparency. If that foundation is weak, no agreement will last. South Korea's appeal to the US for unlimited swaps was, in other words, a declaration that it did not believe in local currencies. The words of an American economist who echoed this are symbolic. A government that cannot protect its own currency is trying to supplement its trust with dollars from other countries. Investors around the world are now quietly watching South Korea's economic system. The increase in household debt, the trade deficit after interest, and the outflow of foreign currency are signs reminiscent of the Asian currency crisis of 1997. Among those who know the history of Japan's leadership in saving Korea at that time, there is a growing sense that no one will come to the rescue this time. The unlimited bailout requested by the South Korean government was ultimately passed around to the United States, and the market fell into chaos once again. Ironically, this incident ended up reaffirming Japan's reliability to the world. The unlimited support with the United States ended up being a pipe dream, and the South Korean government fell into chaos once again. Although foreign exchange reserves did appear to exceed $380 billion, in reality, the amount of liquid assets that could be used immediately was less than half of that, and a new term, the dollar shortage shock, was coined domestically. The market fluctuated unstably, and foreign currency continued to flee the stock market. In this way, South Korea fell into a typical vicious cycle that countries that have lost trust fall into. It sank into a triple spiral of currency depreciation, high inflation, and low growth. Nevertheless, the government remained bullish. The Lee Jin administration is not in crisis. Rather, they emphasized that it was a machine, and continued to maintain a half-hearted attitude toward the domestic market. Far from asking Japan for help, they even said that Japan feared the South Korean economy. However, the international community remained calm. Japan has traditionally gained the trust of the world as a hard currency, while South Korea is a representative of soft currencies, and sadly, it is one of the currencies that is sold off at the end. The more South Korea tried to protect itself, the more global investors realized the contradiction. For example, despite being in the same Asian region, Japanese bonds continue to be held by financial institutions around the world as safe assets. On the other hand, even though international government bonds have high yields, they are not suitable for long-term investment due to the risk premium. It is not simply a difference in economic power, but a difference in the credibility of the countries. Ironically, it was the young people in South Korea who were most sensitive to this reality. With the collapse of the employment and inflation debate and their daily lives becoming increasingly difficult, they began to get excited on the internet. No one can be trusted anymore. I envy their connections in politics and currency. That country has maintained its credibility for decades. It was not just a comparison of economies, but an admiration for their stance as a nation. On the other hand, Japan did not dare to criticize Osaka for the turmoil in South Korea. The Japanese government, which is at the center of high-level demonstrations, has quietly maintained its policy of not helping. Japan has never forgotten the amount of support it provided in past Asian transit systems and the ungrateful words it received afterwards. And this time, it gave its answer in the form of silent diplomacy. Japan is not a bank. In fact, this one word that Odaka uttered at the ASEAN+3 meeting shocked the whole of Asia. This was not mere sarcasm but a clear message. It was a declaration from a mature nation that Japan would no longer act in an emotional manner. Some in South Korea criticized Japan for becoming cold, but that is not the case. Japan is simply prioritizing cooperation with trustworthy countries while taking responsibility as a member of the international community. As a result, cooperation with the United States, the EU, and Asian countries has deepened, and the situation in which South Korea is becoming isolated has become clearer. Some economists call South Korea's current state diplomatically self-destructive. The price of continuing to spend half of its time on politics has finally come back to bite it in the international economy. Export industries rely on Japanese technology while keeping Japan in check. In finance, they are demanding dollars while imposing conditions on the US. On the surface, they are shouting the facts, but in reality, all of these economic structures that are based on the assumptions of other countries, situations are coming to an end. And ironically, behind the sluggishness of the Korean economy, Japanese companies such as Toyota, Mitsubishi, and Brussels are gradually regaining their presence in the world stage. What was once a lag has been rebuilt into a trustworthy and quality-oriented country, and is once again returning to the top in the EU, the US, and Southeast Asia. While the Korean economy is in turmoil, Japan is silently building up trust. This great retreat is now making a strong impression around the world. Even within the Korean government, some people are beginning to taste the fruits of this. We can no longer survive on half a day. We have made ourselves poor by exploiting Japan. However, these voices are still small. They are not reaching the core of the government. The domestic media continues to call Japan an economic railway country and tries to criticize the government by stirring up half-hearted emotions. However, most of the people have lost interest in this old drama. The reality is cold, and immediate life is all that matters. On the other hand, the Japanese media and politicians do not support Korea and continue to live on. Some overseas articles report that Japan has abandoned South Korea, but that is not true. To be precise, Japan will no longer be swayed by the tide. Rather than repeating diplomacy that is met with retaliation, Japan's current diplomacy is supported by its calm judgment to protect the interests of taxpayers and build a future with reliable partners. South Korea is no longer simply in the grip of the economy. It is a crisis of trust. More than any currency increase or aid agreement, it is extremely difficult for a country that has lost its asset of trust to recover. The EU's full-scale measures and the US's refusal to accept swaps all point to the same answer. Japan is simply staring at the reality that it no longer trusts its people, without making a fuss about it. Its silence is the strongest message. Various opinions have been received from people overseas on this topic, so I would like to introduce some of them. The EU's defense policy is not protectionism but the revival of trustism. It is only natural that the opposition has been excluded. Speaking badly about Japan will not change the reality. I am Korean, but I envy Japan's stability. What did you think? The EU's strengthening of its tax system, its refusal to accept unlimited swaps, and its loss of trust from the international community. South Korea is facing not only the economy but also the collapse of its sleeper diplomacy. The more it raises its voice, the more isolated it becomes, and the more it asks for help, the more it loses credibility. Meanwhile, Japan is returning to the center of the world through quiet diplomacy and steady industrial development. While its neighbor, which it once helped, is repeating the same apologies. Japan is simply learning, making amends, and moving forward. Perhaps that is true strength. Please let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.
Allies should be entities that trust each other. However, South Korea has come to see us as an untrustworthy partner.
Hello, this is Ko. The incident in which South Korea has significantly damaged the trust of the international community is quietly but surely spreading ripples. Behind the ultimatum issued by the US government in a calm tone was a growing sense of suspicion and anger. The seemingly fraudulent acts of aluminum foil and falsifying the origin of products were actually directly linked to South Korea's persistent diplomatic stance and economic performance. This time, we will consider what trust means in the international community through the rift that has occurred between the US and South Korea. Please watch until the end. A single word spoken at a press conference by the US government in the spring of 2025 quietly shocked the world. The relationship of trust with the South Korean government is reaching a critical juncture. We cannot afford to let this slide any longer. The tone was calm and collected. However, there was no hiding the anger seeping into the official ranks. Reporters at the White House press room in Washington reportedly felt the strange atmosphere firsthand. A few days later, the US government released some of the diplomatic exchanges with South Korea as a form of consolation. In effect, it was an ultimatum. The direct trigger for this series of moves was the aluminum foil counterfeiting scandal. It was discovered that a South Korean company had been exporting aluminum foil imported from China to the US by changing the country of origin labels and falsely labeling it as Korean. This was a clear violation of the WTO and an act of intentionally circumventing the US tax exemption policy. Furthermore, the aluminum foil targeted was not just a household item. It was a product that played a strategic role, such as in the self-propelled shielding of military drones and in protecting battery packs. In other words, this was a problem concerning US national security, and it was not something that could be dismissed as a mere incident. The US side regarded this matter as a serious betrayal that violated the rules of the land. This is because South Korea is a country protected under the umbrella of US security, and its safety is guaranteed through the US Forces Korea. The US government, Congress, and the entire nation were suddenly filled with anger at the attitude of South Korea trying to gain profits by committing fraud behind the scenes while being protected by the US. The US Congress passed a resolution of condemnation over this issue. A senior member of the Showa Party made the following statement: "Allies should be entities that build mutual trust. However, South Korea has come to regard us as an untrustworthy partner." A member of the Democratic Party continued, "This incident is a betrayal that goes beyond a so-called violation of the rules. Any further information will only threaten the national interests of the US." The South Korean government initially tried to dismiss this matter as a unilateral act by a few companies, but the US side came up with another excuse. The investigation revealed that some relevant agencies of the South Korean government may have been aware of the existence of this deception, and the situation became even more serious. This issue eventually spread to other strategic materials from South Korea. Many industrial sectors, including batteries, reactors, and automobile parts, have come under scrutiny for quality certification and country of origin certification, and Korean companies in the US have been investigated one after another. In this way, the brand image that Korea has come to realize, such as technology and reliability, has begun to be greatly shaken. Furthermore, the cause of the problem was excessive reliance on China. Korean companies, emphasizing cost reduction and mass production, relied on imports of many materials and raw materials from China. In particular, rare earth metals such as neodymium and dysprosium are essential resources that support Korea's cutting-edge industries. However, the practice of procuring these materials from China, processing parts in China, and exporting them as products with the "Made in Korea" label was beginning to be seen as an international problem, as it was seen as essentially falsifying the country of origin. In addition, there were many cases where Korean engineers were poached by Chinese companies. This led to the outflow of technology from Korea to China, and further created the problem of the blurring of the line between Chinese and Korean quality. From the US perspective, Korea could no longer be considered a reliable technological nation. The background to this is the failure of so-called coalition diplomacy. South Korea under the Jae-in administration has continued to maintain a neutral stance between the United States and China. While outwardly calling itself an ally of the United States, in reality it has shown a cooperative attitude toward China on a one-on-one basis and has taken an informational stance toward North Korea. This half-hearted diplomatic stance has heightened America's suspicions, and the recent aluminum fraud issue has become the flaming point. American public opinion is now leaning toward the view that South Korea is no longer a trustworthy partner. Some reports have also suggested that the United States is considering a top-down FTA with South Korea or a sanctions-based import regime. South Korea is now facing an unprecedented crisis of diplomatic isolation. Behind the seemingly calm response of the US government lies dissatisfaction and anger over responsibility. And this anger is quietly but surely destroying the alliance that was once bound by words of trust. The aluminum fraud issue by South Korea was initially considered a domestic issue in the United States. However, as the United States released diplomatic documents and the South Korean government's ambiguous response came to light, the situation rapidly developed into an international issue. The international community focused its attention on South Korea because it was seen as a country that had betrayed trust. The European Union, EU, showed a particularly strong reaction. European trade authorities independently analyzed trading data on South Korean companies released by the US and pointed out that similar labeling fraud was suspected in some industrial materials imported and exported from South Korea to the EU. In response, several countries including Germany, France and Italy decided to temporarily suspend imports of South Korean aluminum and battery materials. Many developed countries have begun to reconsider South Korea's long-standing claim at the WTO that Japan's tightening of export controls is unjustified. Japan has been strictly controlling exports of strategic materials such as hydrogen to South Korea since 2019, but at the time, South Korea criticized this as political retaliation. However, the aluminum issue has suddenly led to a widespread view that South Korea lacks management capabilities and credibility. Some UN member states have begun to question South Korea's industrial ethics themselves. Australia and Canada in particular have declared that they will review joint projects they have been working on with South Korea. These countries had included South Korea as a member of the Resource Security Alliance, RSA, a framework to counter China in the supply of rare earths and other metals, but they began to treat it as an unreliable partner. What is noteworthy here is that each country's response placed emphasis on ethics rather than simple economic sanctions. A British economist wrote, "South Korea's failure began with a single aluminum foil. However, it was a lid-mouth test that tested how much a country values trust." In other words, South Korea has proven the principle that trust is like economic currency, and once lost, it is not easily regained. So why did the international community suddenly lose sight of South Korea? It is because the foundation of hardship built up during the Moon Jae-in administration collapsed all at once due to this incident. The Moon administration condemned all government officials one after another under the pretext of the Kansan sand scandal, and even carried out thorough crackdowns on the judicial, administrative, and conglomerates. As a result, the sanctions section, which is the foundation of South Korea's system, has effectively become dysfunctional, and an abnormal atmosphere has emerged in which companies that oppose the government will be exiled. In such a political environment, companies were forced to conduct business while keeping an eye on the government's mood, and even international companies that should have placed importance on compliance began to tolerate fraud and falsification as a necessary part of their operations. Furthermore, the Mu administration adopted a diplomatic policy of denuclearization, center-center, and denuclearization, significantly deviating from the path that South Korea should have taken. In particular, the denuclearization policy caused South Korea, which had been one of the world's leading nuclear power exporters, to lose its competitiveness in an instant, and many large-scale projects underway in the Middle East and East Asia were cancelled or frozen. As a result, South Korea came to be seen as a country that changes its mind frequently and as a risky country whose policies change when the government changes. Furthermore, behind the ostensible goal of promoting domestic production of parts and materials, it sent a false message to the market that it was okay to lower quality in order to exclude Japan. As a result, international trust in domestic products was gradually eroded, and the recent aluminum foil scandal made it all the more questionable. This final blow resulted in a review of the country's own credit rating. At the end of June 2025, an international credit rating agency downgraded South Korea's industrial ethics rating to B+/BA. As a result, many international companies began to postpone joint development with South Korea, and the success rate of South Korean companies in international bidding plummeted. In fact, the joint energy supply network between the US, South Korea, and Japan, which had been scheduled for July, was announced without South Korea due to strong requests from the US, resulting in an unusual situation. Japan and the US had already begun to distance themselves from South Korea, even in this unofficial manner. And the mood in the international community was clear. South Korea could no longer be entrusted with important strategies. Opportunities to speak at international conferences gradually decreased, and statements made by the South Korean delegation at the G20 and APEC were met with cold stares from other countries. Trust can be destroyed in an instant, and it takes decades of resilience and great effort to regain lost trust. As the aluminum foil counterfeiting incident caused ripples in the international community, an unusual atmosphere hung over South Korea. The government's official announcements were always trying to cover it up by claiming that it was a misunderstanding and not an intentional mistake. But the public's reaction was positive. Rather, this incident suddenly brought to the surface a certain emotion that had been simmering among South Koreans. That was suspicion about the time. On SNS, young people posted self-deprecating comments one after another, using hashtags such as K-Standard, which were no less surprising. Oh, here we go again. I wonder in which field the lies will be exposed next. What kind of world are we talking about when we were taught in school that Korea is respected by the world? One anonymous post written by a university student in particular caused a stir. We have always been taught that Korea is a great public-private country that the world envies. But what is the reality? We have betrayed the trust of other countries, and at home, the conglomerates and the government are in collusion, and lies and deception are the norm. We can no longer be proud. This post was once again widely shared, garnering hundreds of thousands of likes. The comments section was filled with voices asking if there is no hope for Korea's future, and even some people who once professed patriotism were beginning to distance themselves from the country. Meanwhile, serious developments were also taking place in the business community. Small and medium-sized business owners were facing the reality that the Korean brand was beginning to have a negative effect on their overseas transactions. The president of a machine parts manufacturer says he was told by a European customer via email, "We would like to postpone doing business with South Korea for a while. Please find a common source." Quote. Korean products, which had previously been praised for their high quality and low cost, had suddenly fallen into the category of questionable products. Behind this was the growing suspicion that aluminum foil was not the only problem. In other words, one irregularity had destroyed trust in the entire country. Furthermore, employment in South Korea was beginning to be affected. Projects for joint development with overseas companies and the establishment of research centers were cancelled one after another, and job openings for technical positions, interpreters, researchers, and other specialized positions plummeted. The employment situation for young people in particular became serious. The term Hell Korea became popular during the Moon Jae-in administration, and it has begun to be used again among young people. However, this time it was not just a feeling, but a reality that hard work does not pay off. There is no future except for going abroad. These kinds of voices were spreading among people in their 20s. And this feeling of self-doubt eventually turned into anger towards the government itself. Why did the country lie to its citizens? Why is it so desperate to hide the problem? The South Korean government held numerous press conferences after the exams and continued to claim that a few companies were to blame. However, to the public, this was seen as nothing more than a case of shifting the blame. In particular, dissatisfaction with the selective justice of past administrations was rekindled. They kept the past administration quiet, but will they overlook their own crimes? Amidst such doubts, many conductors and professors from all walks of life began to sound the alarm on TV and online media. This is an incident that calls into question the very values of South Korea. Trust cannot be restored unless the culture of lying, as long as it is not discovered, is corrected. Unless the social structure in which lies for the sake of the national interest are tolerated is reformed, nothing will change no matter what administration comes to power. One commentator described this incident as the moment when the mask that South Korean society had built up came off. In fact, the brand image that South Korea had been promoting as a reliable democratic nation and an advanced country that is paving the way for the future with its technological capabilities is no longer functioning in international circles. Rather, the negative image of prioritizing emotions, shifting the blame, and an opaque power structure has suddenly come to the fore. Amidst this, diplomatic issues have also become more serious. Although the alliance with the US is maintained in name only, in reality many of the games are closed to the public, and the triangular cooperation between the Japanese and US governments has also been strained. And this pride eventually extended to the half-day government. How many opportunities did we miss while we were keeping Japan in check? It was no time to be idle. Trying to unite the country in half a day has reached its limit. These opinions, which were once difficult to voice, have become prominent on social media and in the forum, and this has created a new division between conservatives and those who are convinced. In other words, the single incident of aluminum fraud has become a mirror that confronts the people with the contradictions and distortions that are deeply rooted in Korean society. The reason why the US reacted so abnormally to the incident of South Korea's aluminum fraud is not simply anger at tax evasion, but is deeply connected to the concept of economic security. For the US, too, the economy and security are not separate. In particular, along with the Chinese president, the reliability and transparency of the supply chain have become a core part of national strategy. In the midst of all this, the fact that an ally like South Korea was acting dishonestly behind the scenes and was overly dependent on China was exposed, causing the United States to feel anger towards South Korea as a traitor who pretended to be an ally. In fact, the U.S. Department of Defense issued a strong warning in its 2023 report. The origin of strategic materials is an act that directly threatens national security. In addition to aluminum foil, these strategic materials include battery materials, rare earths, and reaction mass. These are essential elements of all modern military-industrial infrastructure, and the trust in who is making them is what supports the foundation of national security. On the surface, South Korea is a country that belongs to the West and is supposed to share the values of freedom and democracy. However, starting with the Moon Jae-in administration, it has repeatedly built close ties with China over the past 10 years. A typical example of this is the case where South Korea suddenly clashed with the United States over the advanced missile defense system and took measures that were considerate of China. This kind of two-faced diplomacy was also evident in the world of economics. It has been pointed out that a major South Korean battery manufacturer has been working closely with China's CATL to promote technological cooperation within China, and that there is even a possibility that parts from Japan and the United States have been indirectly supplied to China for reactionary device-related equipment. In other words, in the process of expanding its business with China, South Korea has established a route for the flow of important technologies and materials to countries that are strategic rivals of the United States and Japan. The United States is strongly wary of this structure, as it is directly linked to the storage of military power through the economy. The current war is no longer just about guns and missiles. By stopping the supply of batteries, enemy countries can accelerate their military development, and by restricting the export of lithium and cobalt, mass production of drones and electric vehicles can be hindered. Strategies that use the economy as a weapon are the main battlefield of national security today. South Korea has become a weak spot on that battlefield. This is the essence of America's anger. Biden is already working to strengthen relations with allies in the Indo-Pacific region under the pretext of rebuilding a reliable supply chain. As countries that follow the principles of transparency and patriotism, such as Japan, Australia, and India, are given priority, South Korea is gradually being excluded from that framework. There is also some discussion in the U.S. Congress about reviewing the GSOMIA, the Security of Military Information Agreement with South Korea. In other words, South Korea is beginning to be seen as an unreliable partner not only in the economic sphere but also in the military sphere. This change is progressing quietly but surely. For example, there are battery factories operating in several U.S. states. Projects that have previously been centered on South Korean companies such as LG, Samsung, and SK are accelerating their shift to joint projects with Japan's Panasonic and European companies as of 2025. Some states have already begun to freeze new contracts with South Korean companies. It has also become clear that South Korea will remain in an observer position and will not be given voting rights in the joint development of next-generation reaction vehicles led by Japan and the U.S. This has led to concerns that South Korea will be left out of global technology initiatives. Amidst these trends, Japan's presence is increasing relatively. This is because Japan maintains the asset of trust with the U.S. Over the past few decades, Japan has maintained its basic diplomatic policy without wavering, even when the government changed, and has steadily abided by contracts and international rules. Both companies and countries have consistently maintained a stance of not breaking promises once made, and now that value is being re-evaluated. South Korea, on the other hand, has taken the exact opposite path. Political retaliation by the government, arbitrary judicial manipulation in the name of breaking up the chaebols, and emotional diplomacy that promotes decoupling and centering. All of these have eroded the self-confidence that is called trust. Some in South Korea have complained that the U.S. is cold, but America's attitude has been completely consistent. It will not tolerate betrayal. That's all there is to it. When the U.S. government began to take a tough stance toward South Korea, which could be called an ultimatum, the South Korean government rushed to respond on the spot. The first thing it said was that it was a typical case of deviation from the norms of a few companies and had nothing to do with national policy. This was followed by a formal announcement that an investigation would begin. However, the U.S. response was cold and silent because the U.S. had already secured multiple pieces of evidence, including internal communications between South Korean companies and government agencies that handled tax return submissions by email. In other words, it was not yet time to use the excuse that they did not know. The South Korean government further argued that aluminum fraud was a definitive violation of WTO regulations and that judgment should be withheld until a conclusion was reached through an international trial. However, this statement instead angered the United States and the international community. This is because many countries felt that the attitude of ignoring deliberate wrongdoing and trying to escape with the excuse of a police officer was the worst habit of South Korean diplomacy. In Europe, media outlets in France and the Netherlands reported as follows: the South Korean government's response is like arguing about the interpretation of the law without pouring water on a fire. The problem is not the success itself, but the attitude toward achieving it. As such criticisms emerged one after another, suspicions of the government grew even stronger in South Korea. Voices grew stronger, especially among young people in small and medium-sized enterprises, saying that in the end the government was simply protecting large corporations and conglomerates. They also said that a trend was spreading where it was okay to lie for the sake of the country. However, at this moment, the South Korean government played its usual card, criticizing Japan. After all, isn't it Japan that has not apologized to the international community for the issues surrounding post-war settlement? Japan has dealt with similar so-called issues in the past in an opaque manner. What is needed now is a Japan that can break free from them. Such statements have been made day after day by ruling party members and the new government media. This was clearly intended to divert domestic public opinion outward. In other words, they were trying to divert criticism with a half-day boost. However, this method, which had been effective in the past, was completely ineffective as of 2025. Rather, the response from the international community was cold. A major American official wrote, "Japan has nothing to do with this issue." South Korea's attitude of shifting responsibility has become even more critical. The Japanese government also reacted quickly, which is unusual for them, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that it would strongly protest against statements that are unrelated to the facts. The cooperation between Japan and the US government has become stronger, and South Korea has become isolated. Moreover, even within South Korea, a rejection of this half-day card has begun to become noticeable. It's Japan's fault again. Please stop. It was they who caused the problem. Before talking about Japan, they should first face their own shame. These kinds of voices were often heard, mainly from younger generations. The more I spend half a day on SNS, the more foolish South Korea seems. How long will they continue to engage in diplomacy based on intuition? These comments touched on the topic, and the neo-Japanese perspective that was once often criticized has now come to be seen as a realistic opinion. The South Korean government's excuses and shifting of responsibility have ultimately accelerated the decline in trust. Companies are increasingly refusing to accept orders from overseas. Credit rating reviews are also in full swing. Furthermore, the market has fallen, and international investors have begun to view the South Korean market as a risk area. Despite these circumstances, the South Korean government continues to be optimistic that it can quickly restore trust. In particular, the government's statement that South Korea is needed by the world has become a target of criticism both domestically and internationally. An American economist stated on a TV program that what is needed is a trustworthy country, not a country with a high self-esteem. These words struck a chord with South Korean society as a powerful irony. So what is the reason for South Korea's repeated apologies? It lies in the domestic atmosphere. In South Korea, politicians and bureaucrats prioritize public support above all else. The media also tends to be restrained from criticizing the government, as they risk being immediately labeled as pro-Japanese or anti-government. As a result, a structure was created in which the government refused to look at the essence of the problem and only repeated excuses for domestic consumption. And the concept of trust was almost non-existent there. From the spring to the summer of 2025, South Korea dramatically lost the trust of the international community. It all started with the seemingly counterfeit labeling of aluminum products. However, that was just the tip of a mountain of deep-seated problems that the South Korean nation was plagued with. Through this issue, the international community was confronted with a question. What is most important for an ally? Economic power? Military strength? Diplomatic balance? The answer is none of these. The most important thing is trust. Even if a country lacks resources or is technologically backward, a country that is trusted by the international community has the power to carve out a future. Conversely, a country that cannot be trusted, no matter how much economic growth it has achieved, will become isolated and eventually be left behind. What South Korea lost in this incident was precisely this trust. And the biggest reason for this loss of trust was not simply misconduct, but continued lying, refusal to take responsibility, and blaming others. The the US government is now starting to take a clear distance from South Korea. In particular, the Biden administration's security strategy emphasizes the policy of integrating economy and security, and clearly states that cooperation with unreliable countries should be kept to a minimum. This policy has already been reflected in new treaty joint projects with multiple allies. For example, South Korea's participation in the EP Indo-Pacific Framework, a supply chain strengthening initiative between Japan and the US, has been postponed. The names of South Korean companies are not on the priority supply list for rare earth procurement newly agreed upon by the Japanese and US officials. And that's not all. In the summer of 2025, the US Congress's Super East Committee began full-scale discussions on reviewing the FTA with South Korea. The reason is clear. South Korea is a risky country that disregards contracts and trust. This is the exact opposite of the position that South Korea once claimed to be the guardian of global standards. The South Korean government is anxious, but has not been able to take concrete action to restore trust. As long as domestic politics are structured in a way that always places importance on the unstable winds of public opinion, the gap with international evaluation will not be closed. Ironically, Japan's position has actually been strengthened by this. Japan has never been a flashy diplomat. However, Japan has built up trust from the world through a steady accumulation of promises, strict adherence to rules, and sincere responses. For example, when Japan proceeded with the release of treated water from a nuclear power plant into the ocean in accordance with international standards and with transparency, the first countries to voice their support were the United States, Canada, Australia, and European countries. This is in contrast to South Korea's emotional criticism of this. What countries are looking for now is not a convenient country, but a trustworthy country. Japan should continue to maintain this position. In contrast to South Korea, which once shouted, "Get out of Japan, get out of nuclear power, get out of America," and destroyed the international community's trust network, Japan should continue to make efforts to protect and cultivate its asset of trust. The race for technology is fierce. China is hoarding resources, and Russia is trying to destroy the international order. In such unstable times, what we must value most is being a trusted partner. Finally, I would like to introduce one memorable statement made during the exchange of opinions with the United States. South Korea may have technology, but Japan has trust. That is the most valuable resource. These words were not just sarcasm. They were a frank message that spoke to how much trust the world needs today. What did you think? Trust is a nation's greatest weapon, and also its most vulnerable asset. South Korea's series of actions have taught us how fatal it can be to lose it. Going forward, Japan should further foster trust in the international community, using honesty and transparency as its weapons. Trust is the foundation of diplomacy and the economy. Please let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end.